Welcome to the Triage Method Podcast with me, Gary McGowan, and my co-host, Mr. Patrick Farrell. As you guys know, if you listen to the podcast regularly, or you've been keeping up on our social media, we did recently hire a new coach, Mr. Lee Hand. Delighted to have Lee on board, and that means that we have even more online coaching space available now. So if you are interested in our online coaching service and you want to take the information provided in these podcasts and make it as personal as possible in application, then the online coaching one-to-one could be the service for you. So you can check out more information about that below in the description box. And that is the sales done. Let's get into this week's topic, or Q&A topic rather. And the question this week is, for some context, the last couple of weeks, we have been talking a lot about cardio. So we talked about the implementation of general cardiovascular training protocols. And then what we also talked about was whether or not cardio is actually compulsory. So it kind of makes sense then to answer when you should do your cardio after that. So should you do it before your weight training or after your weight training, assuming that you have to do both together? Because obviously the ideal would be like, oh yeah, just separate them. But like, that's not practical for a lot of people. So that is this week's question.
Yeah, and it's a really smart question, but it's also something that potentially people don't question. They just do what they've always been told to do. And that can look like a number of things. That can look like someone just doing their cardio before resistance training, which has pros and cons. And it can look like someone just doing their cardio after resistance training, which again has pros and cons, right? So I suppose the first thing to consider is what you said there, and whether you should do them together or separate them entirely, right? Now, when we look at any of when we look at this question, we want to look at it from the perspective of what is the actual goal? Like, what are we actually trying to achieve by doing resistance training? And then what are we trying to achieve by doing cardiovascular training? Because if you don't know the goal and you're just, ticking the boxes, so to speak, with just, I just do my cardio training or I just do my resistance training, you can potentially set yourself up to not really achieve a huge amount in terms of what you want to do. Not necessarily you won't get where you want to be, but it may take you longer because of the approach you've taken, right? And what I mean by that is there is potentially some interference between these two aspects. There's some interference between the resistance training adaptations, especially as it relates to strength gain and muscle gain, and then also the cardiovascular adaptations, especially as it relates to we'll say the endurance side of things. Obviously if you get closer to the same energy system use as you would be using in resistance training, like say for example you do your resistance training and then you do something more like high intensity interval style training, which is more similar to your resistance training, there's potentially less of an interference effect than if you did something completely different energy system wise and you did your resistance training and then you went for an hour run. So we have to take into account a lot. However, I actually don't think to discuss this, we actually need to cover a lot, because the ultimate determinant of what the answer to this question is what are we trying to achieve and where do our priorities lie, right? And that will give you the biggest indication as to how you should structure your training program overall, because you will be able to decide where your priorities actually are, and as a result allocate your resources effectively, right? And what I mean by this is, if your main goal is to improve your cardiovascular fitness, then it probably makes more sense to prioritize that than your resistance training. If your goal is to prioritize getting stronger and changing your body composition perhaps, it probably makes more sense to prioritize your resistance training, right? And ultimately, that is going to be the biggest determinant of all of this. However, we can't just ignore the fact that there is obviously a lot of potential issues that crop up depending on the approach that we take, right? For example, if we do cardiovascular training first, that could potentially make our resistance training less effective and potentially, sorry, I'm just throwing stuff around here. It could potentially make it potentially more injurious. And what I mean by that is, you could do a cardiovascular training program and go into that resistance training program fatigued now, right? So you're somewhat depleted, and that could potentially increase your risk of injury, especially if you start doing stuff that are fatiguing in and of themselves, like say squats or something like that. Now, how big of an issue is that for you and for your overall, physiology, makeup, biomechanics, etc. That is a very individualized thing. You might be an individual that can do 20, 30 minutes of cardio training and then go straight into a heavy leg workout and have no issues. However, you might also be an individual that the fatigue that you've accumulated during that 20, 30 minutes of cardio now leads you to have poor technique when you are resistance training, and that could potentially lead to issues immediately or potentially long term, like down the line. So we have to take that into account. We have to really look at not only what we're trying to prioritize, but then also how we are structuring our training around that priority, because it might make more sense if you are going to do your cardio first, for example, to change the style of training that you do to achieve the goal that you're doing. Perhaps work in either safer ranges for you or stuff that has a bit more stability, because you're taking into account that you're coming into this workout fatigued already. Again, it could also look like, you're managing fatigue like we've talked about before with the training program, in terms of maybe using, reps in reserve. You're using a higher reps in reserve, when you're doing that workout, because you've already come into that workout fatigued, and effectively it comes down to fatigue management then. So not only are we looking at it from the perspective of what is the priority, like what are we trying to achieve, we're also looking at it from the perspective of, if we do prioritize one or the other, then we have to realize that does impact the setup of the other. If we do say we're doing cardiovascular training is a priority, then we have to come into it with the perspective that that's going to influence our resistance training practices, right? Same vice versa. If we're saying resistance training is our priority, then that is going to influence our cardiovascular protocols, and how we set that up, So do you have anything to add to that, Gary?
Yeah. So like one of the things that kind of hit me a while back was that, right, first of all, like most of us that have this discussion, should I do cardio before or after weights? Like we generally coming from the perspective that, oh, well, weight training is obviously like our baseline. Like that's the goal. Like our goal is obviously to just be strong and to build muscle, etc. And cardio is kind of a supplement to that. However, I heard a while back, Alex Hutchinson, he's the author of Endure, and he's a runner and a sports scientist. He writes a lot about the kind of exercise science as it applies to endurance training. So I like reading his writings for that reason. And he gave a different perspective to one that I would have thought about before. And that was that anytime he had kind of resistance training, like he basically said he used to just do a little bit of circuit style resistance training. And he said anytime he was putting that together with his running, he would always do the resistance training first, even though the run was actually his priority, because he knew that if he ran first, he enjoyed running so much that he wasn't going to do his resistance training after. He'd rather do a bit of extra running. So like that's probably like the opposite case to where a lot of people will be coming from when they listen to this podcast. So I think it is worth considering, how your actual like behavior does kind of affect that. Because if you're someone that, let's say you're only trying to do a little bit of cardio, but that when you get into the gym and you do your weights, you're far more likely to just hammer yourself and spend all your gym time on the weights, then maybe getting a bit of cardio before your workout could potentially be beneficial in that case. However, most of the time when people are interested in their strength and hypertrophy outcomes as their primary focus, I'm probably going to tell them to do their weight training first, unless we're saying like, right, we're actually doing lots of heavy interval work that's really lower body focused, and I want you to be able to absolutely hammer out those intervals, then I might get you to do those at the start of the session, so that you actually have more resources available. But like when people are just doing kind of casual, like moderate intensity, low intensity, steady state cardio work, like it's not that demanding. Like putting it in after your workout, it's fine, even if you are a bit tired. Like one of the things I'll encourage some people to do to kind of counteract some of those effects is to, if you have a scoop of whey or even a half scoop of whey and some sort of carbohydrate powder or a carbohydrate drink, if you can have that like sipping away while you're doing your cardio after your resistance training workout, that's going to basically take away any potential concerns of, that affecting your muscle gain outcomes or whatever. Because let's say you are doing an hour of steady state, like that's an hour you're adding on before having your protein feeding post workout, while continuing to dig into your energy stores. So you could definitely make a case that having some sort of nutrients in that window would be beneficial for your hypertrophy outcomes. So yeah, they'd be some points that I just add on.
Yeah. So again, like there's a lot of considerations to make with this. And again, like there is no right answer as a general rule, right? If you were to ask me for a general rule answer, I would probably say, resistance training first and then do your cardiovascular work, right? And that's probably because resistance training offers you more bang for your buck in terms of progressibility, in terms of like you can just slowly over time add weights, and that's a good priority. However, it's a lot harder to progress cardiovascular training beyond a point, unless you start increasing time, right? Obviously there is, of course, loads of methods, and there's a lot of progress to be made until you get to that point, but it does become some sort of a limiting factor where with resistance training, you can just always add a little bit more weight, or, slow down the tempo or whatever. We've talked about, progression methods before. So as resistance training is more progressible, I would generally prioritize that, and confounding the fact that doing resistance training is probably more beneficial for a lot of populations than doing cardiovascular training. Not to say that it's one or the other, like you should just do both. But for a lot of people, they get to a stage where strength is a limiting factor for them, and you could argue that doing aerobic work is probably the biggest determinant of long-term health. I don't think anyone would disagree with that. But one of the biggest determinants of long-term health. But you also get a lot of aerobic adaptations and a lot of cardiovascular adaptations from doing resistance training as well. Whereas the flow isn't the same, the opposite way, in terms of you don't necessarily get a huge amount stronger from doing cardiovascular training. Whereas, the flow does seem to work in terms of you get cardiovascular adaptations while doing resistance training, but you don't get resistance training adaptations while doing cardio, at least beyond a certain point. Like you're still going to get some hypertrophy of your leg muscles or your back, whatever muscles it is that are being used for that sporting activity or the cardiovascular activity even. But beyond the point, it's like, well, for most cardiovascular activities, weight becomes an issue. So your body always kind of prioritizes not gaining extra weight if you are trying to really push your cardiovascular adaptation. So again, there's a lot of trade-offs, a lot of pros and cons to both. If you were to be like, gun to my head, right, which one are you going to choose? I would say do resistance training first and then do your cardiovascular training afterwards. However, again, we do have to realize that there are going to be populations where that's not necessarily the best approach. And, if you are, say, for example, someone that is strong enough for your sport, like you're already at the level of strength that's needed for you to be very successful in your sport, but your cardiovascular fitness is a limiting factor for your long-term progress, then I probably would prioritize cardiovascular stuff at least until we get to that stage where your cardiovascular fitness is exactly where it needs to be for you to progress in your sport. So we have to take that into account, that for some people, doing their cardio first is going to be more beneficial than doing it after their workout, because again, like you said, some people might not enjoy their cardio and it becomes a limiting factor in their progress because they always skip doing cardio after they've done their resistance training. So we have to take a lot of factors into account. However, for most people, I would just say do your cardio after your resistance training, unless you have a specific need or want, I suppose, to do it before your resistance training. Because again, the flow through of adaptations, you get some cardiovascular adaptations from resistance training, and you don't necessarily get those resistance training benefits from cardiovascular training. And then also, it's, especially if you're doing lower intensity cardiovascular work, it's very easy to still put a high level of output into that after you've done resistance training. And that's not necessarily true the opposite way. You're not able to, or potentially not able to train very hard, really progress your resistance training after you've done cardiovascular training, and you're coming into that session with a bit more fatigue now as a result.
Yeah, like I think, to be honest, a sound heuristic is like, if you call cardio, you can probably do it after. But if it is like genuinely like sports specific sprint training, like if you're doing like 4x400 meters, like do that before. Do that. You don't want to do that after a big heavy squat and deadlift session. Like, yeah, you'll probably be fine. But I mean, if you're actually seeking performance outcomes, then that's a totally different ball game. So if you're coming at this from an athletics background or anything like that, you'd be better off to do that stuff first. So yeah, it really does depend on what the actual goal is. But if you're just like, I want to add in a bit of cardio, get a bit fitter, maybe increase my energy expenditure so I have an easier time in body fat, then like doing it after is probably best case scenario at the time. Like, I don't know about you, but like personally, even though I care more about my like Brazilian jiu-jitsu at the moment than I do about my resistance training, I still prefer to do weight training first before I do BJJ. Like if I was to choose what do I want to do in the morning, what do I want to do in the evening, I'd rather do my weight training in the morning and do BJJ in the evening. And I think that's probably because a lot of the time when you're doing things like cardio, you're doing some sports training that's not properly like max effort, like resistance training almost always ends up being more determined by your maximal force output than the other things do. So for example, in jiu-jitsu, like there's many other fitness components that are coming together and skill components to determine your performance, and your performance on the given day in training like isn't really that important. Whereas like with resistance training, if you're dropping your squat down from 140 for 10 to 120 for 10 because you trained earlier in the day, I think that affects people way more, because it's really numerical. It's all quantified. Whereas if you have a bad day at soccer training or jiu-jitsu or anything that you happen to compete in, it's kind of like, oh yeah, I didn't have a great day, but it's not quantified. It's not there in front of you. Whereas with weight training, it's really there in front of you. So I think that hits people a little bit more. So for most people who are really interested in weight training, I would say just do it first. Pop in your cardio after. And if you are concerned about potential muscle loss implications, then I would add in some sort of intra-workout nutrition, whether that be during the first session, during the interim between that and your cardio, or simply sipping on it during your cardio. And that need would increase again if you're performing that in the morning fasted. So if you're performing fasted weight training, which you generally wouldn't recommend, but to be honest, I do it myself a lot of the time, I'm willing to accept the trade-off. Like, if you're doing that, like that's probably slightly suboptimal already to be doing weight training in a fasted condition versus having eaten before. But if you're then adding in extra time and extra exercise after weight training while still fasted, then that further compounds any potential trade-offs that are there. Now, that mightn't matter if you're a beginner or even if you're an intermediate who's like, oh yeah, I'm kind of happy with how my training's going. But if you're trying to step things up a notch and you're actually worrying about these variables, then having some intra-workout nutrition there would probably be advisable, I think.
Yeah, I think that actually just answers the question. Should you do your cardio before or after your weights? And the answer is it depends. I would probably 95, 97% of the time just recommend do your cardio after your resistance training. If you are an athlete, yeah, separate is the
ideal, but not always possible.
Yeah. As Gary said, if you are doing something like which has a large skill component, then that might change things. Like you are doing actual sprints, like actual sprinting, not just like sprints on a bike. And if you're actually sprinting, like running, maybe you do want to do that before your resistance training, just so you're not coming into those sprints fatigued because they are quite demanding. But unless it's a skill component you're trying to work on, unless it is a very sports specific reason, or unless you just enjoy doing your cardio first and that just sets you up for the workout, then I would just do it afterwards. Like, yeah, you can do some beforehand, as a kind of warm up, get some calories burned. That's fine, whatever. But if you are doing like a 20-minute run before your workout, that's probably going to negatively affect the ability you have to progress your weights in the gym, doing your resistance training, whereas the opposite isn't necessarily true. If you do your resistance training first and then you do your run, like the calorie expenditure or the level of intensity you can put into that 20-minute run isn't really affected by doing resistance training,
Yep, I would agree with that. So other than that, I don't think we've really much else.
Nothing else to add.
Nope. So as you guys know, if you'd like to engage more with our services, or you'd like to just find out more about the information we're putting out, the newsletter is a good place to start. You can join that in the description box below. That goes out every Sunday. It includes all the content we've shared it throughout the week. It includes an exclusive article that doesn't go out anywhere else, and it includes recommended resources from around the internet, things that we have found to be helpful and things that, you know, might help you out. It's not always directly fitness related, but, you know, being a complete individual is fairly recommended, because life goes beyond the gym, believe it or not. Other than that, you can join the Triage Method community. That is our Facebook group. Free access, open access. Get in there, ask us questions, share anything that you think others might be interested in. If you want to send in training clips, we're more than happy to have a look at them. So yeah, that is recommended as well. And then you can follow our other social media, including the basics: Instagram, Twitter, Facebook. You're going to find similar content in the newsletter, and then subscribe to the YouTube channel. So that does help us out, helps the videos reach more people, helps them seem relevant. And there's other content there that you won't find us kind of sharing on our Instagram or whatever, because obviously 20-minute videos don't fit on Instagram. Not very practical. If you'd like to take things up a notch, you'd like to get your own training really on track, you'd like to develop the skill set to be able to manage your nutrition and your training and your lifestyle in the long run, one-to-one coaching is probably your best call. As we mentioned at the start of the podcast, we do have availability there with myself, Paddy, and Lee. If you're interested in group online coaching, you'd like to, you know, get things in, you'd like to get things on track, but you don't feel you necessarily need one-to-one online coaching, or you don't necessarily have the budget at the moment, group online coaching is a good service for you to get involved with, to still get your training on track, get your nutrition on track, get advice from us, get feedback on your videos and stuff like that. There's male and females options available, and Reed Long is in charge of the female group, and both groups, you know, have good levels of engagement now. You know, people are getting more involved in terms of like asking questions, trying to get feedback on their videos. And so that's something that you could avail of. And if that's not for you and you're like, look, I just want to learn a bit more, I want a program that's there in front of me, but I don't necessarily like, I don't need guidance from people. I'm a lone wolf, bro. The program templates and the beginner's guidebook is a good place to start. Even if you're a personal trainer and, you know, you've done a PT cert, but you're kind of like, oh, I'm not sure what are the principles of training and nutrition and all that, the beginner's guidebook is actually a pretty good start, because it's a good sweep all of all the things that you need to be thinking about when it comes to nutrition, but when it comes to training, and even some special population stuff. Like if you're thinking, I've got a client and they're 70 years old, are they able to weight train? You know, we've got stuff like that in there as well. We've got sample there, including programs for, like, you know, training at home, for training in the farmyard, you know, different ideas, and it can definitely inspire you to get on the training path. So that's the beginner's guidebook, and the program templates, they're just program templates, multiple different program options in there. And again, they come along with thousands and thousands and thousands of words of information to inform you on why we try to make the decisions that we're making, because that's ultimately what empowers you for the long run. So that is all of our services, and I have nothing else to add other than that it is, in fact, too easy.
I literally have nothing else to add. So enjoy the rest of your week, guys. Peace out.